because it is God. The universe is thus without meaning, yet at the same time is its own meaning. Many of Spinoza's ideas have a deep resonance and are illuminating to those who neither believe in God nor his system. His theory of emotions is particularly prescient. Unlike so many pre-20th century philosophical theories, Spinoza's does not appear inadequate or naive, or just plain wrong, in the light of modern psychology. Desire is defined as the very essence of man, and pleasure is man's transition from a state of less perfection to a state of greater perfection. Pain is the opposite. Spinoza goes on to state, wonder is the thought of anything on which the mind stays fixed, because this particular thought has no connection with any others. Consider this in the light of Plato's celebrated dictum, philosophy begins in wonder. It is not difficult to imagine Spinoza, wrapped in wonder, contemplating his God, who has no connection with any other thing because he is everything. But his definition of love as pleasure accompanied by the idea of an external cause would not seem to accord with his conception of amor intellectualis Dei, the intellectual love of God. In Spinoza's view, and the view of modern psychology, this intellectual love of God would necessarily include an element of self-love, if God and all nature are the same thing, and this element would not have an external cause. Spinoza attempts to defend himself against this charge by maintaining, the mind's intellectual love of God is part of the infinite love by which God loves himself. But this would only seem to confirm the flaw in his argument. Despite such apparent inconsistencies, his theory goes on to prove several profound insights. There is no hope without fear, and no fear without hope. Both confidence and despair arise from the idea of a thing future or past concerning which reason for doubt has been removed. However, this same matter of doubt and error reveals a serious flaw in Spinoza's philosophy. Spinoza himself had no doubts about the truth and certainty of his thought. I do not presume that I have found the best philosophy, but I know that I think the true one. If you ask me how I know this, I shall answer in the same way that you know that the 3 angles of a triangle are equal to 2 right angles. Spinoza viewed doubt and error in a Neoplatonic manner, considering them to be a natural absence or lack in our apprehension of the truth. In other words, doubt and error were in fact unreal, being inadequate or incomplete apprehensions of the truth, which was the only reality. This account is no more adequate than his claim to geometric certainty for his philosophy. And although he could not have known it, in the non-Euclidean geometry of curved surfaces, the 3 angles of a triangle are not invariably equal to 2 right angles. According to Spinoza, the endeavour after self-preservation is the primary and only foundation of virtue. Unfortunately, if self-preservation is primary, how is it possible to account for suicide? Spinoza said that in this case, external and hidden causes may so affect the body as to cause it to put on another nature, contrary to that which it had at first. In other words, suicide is inhuman, and a person is behaving as something other than a human being when he commits suicide. This, like the theory of doubt, is scarcely adequate. But these are minor flaws in a system of great wisdom and insight. Indeed, the subtlety of Spinoza's understanding, and lack of blunders, becomes even more astonishing in light of his insistence on geometry in all circumstances. I regard human actions and desires exactly as if I were dealing with lines, plane surfaces, or solids. In keeping with this approach, Spinoza himself appears to have adopted a somewhat detached attitude toward the world which we lesser human beings inhabit. According to a contemporary, he seemed to live completely within himself, always solitary, as if lost in his thoughts. Indeed, sometimes he would not leave his house for 3 months at a time. Anyone who has experienced a frigid grey Dutch winter, or looked closely at those 17th-century Dutch paintings of ice-bound canals, may not find this so eccentric. Outside his all-absorbing work, his pleasures were few but revealing. In the words of an early biographer, he would collect spiders and set them to fight with one another, or using a magnifying glass he would find some flies, place them in a spider's web, and study the ensuing struggle with great pleasure, even laughing out loud on occasion. In a letter to a friend, Spinoza declared, "Everyone observes with admiration and delight in animals the very things which he detests and regards with aversion in men." His wisdom concerning human nature appears to have been confined to his philosophy. Yet philosophy, despite the etymological roots of its name, is not interested in the love of wisdom. Philosophy is a serious business, and as with any other such, you only stay in business by slaughtering the opposition. The moment Spinoza's system appeared, every philosopher worth his salt went straight for the jugular. Unfortunately, Spinoza's entire system stands or falls on those initial definitions upon which the whole edifice is constructed. If you disprove Spinoza's definition of substance, that's it. No substance, no universe. So how does Spinoza define substance? Definition. I understand by substance, substantia, that which is in itself and is conceived by itself, that is, whose concept needs the concept of no other thing for it to be formed from. To expect philosophers to agree on even something as basic, though craftily worded, as this, was naive of Spinoza. But worse was to come once the theologians started reading the Ethics. If God is merely the deterministic universe, this denies God's transcendence. It also does away with his personality, along with that famous wrath, as well as his free will to choose whether to obey his own laws, the laws of nature, science, etc., or change his mind, miracles, acts of God, etc. According to Spinoza's conception, we can love God as much as we like, but there's no way he can love us in return. This left a lot of people feeling deeply unloved and facing the prospect of all their holiness going unrewarded. By rendering all things holy, Spinoza was to unleash an unholy row. Fortunately, Spinoza realized this might happen, and his Ethics was published posthumously. During his lifetime it was distributed only clandestinely among his philosophic friends. One of these, who also lived at Regensburg, did not behave so prudently, which served as a warning to Spinoza. When Adrian Korbach published his book Light in Dark Places, which attacked contemporary religion, medical practice, and the prevailing moral climate, he was hauled before the courts. Here the prosecutor called for the seizure of all his possessions, his right thumb to be cut off, his tongue to be pierced with a red-hot poker, and a prison sentence of 30 years. Korbach must have felt quite relieved when he was only fined 6,000 florins and given 10 years' hard labour, followed by exile. This shows the sort of trouble you could get into by publicly preaching the wrong ideas, even in liberal Holland, whose moral tolerance was without equal in Europe, and indeed throughout the world, except in the South Seas and the pirate kingdoms of the West Indies. Adrian Korbach was specifically asked at his trial whether he had in any way been influenced by the ideas of Spinoza, a charge he denied, though whether this was due to professional pride or commendable decency is unclear. Spinoza could see which way the wind was blowing. In 1663, Spinoza moved to Voorburg, an outer suburb of The Hague, and was to live in this city for the rest of his life. In a letter he wrote a couple of years later, he makes his only known intentional reference to himself. Other references, such as those regarding insect-like human behavior and the woes of jealousy, were not intended as self-revealing remarks. These were philosophy, or the philosopher speaking, from within his detached winter quarters. Writing to a physician friend, Spinoza tells how he has unsuccessfully tried to remedy a fever by bleeding himself, presumably with leeches, the common medical practice of the period. He goes on to say that he is looking forward to receiving a pot of his friend's red rose jam, and that he has also got over an attack of the ague. By dint of good diet, I at last drove it out and sent it packing. Where it has gone I know not, but I am taking care that it shall not come back. Despite this feeble joke, the unique example of this species in all Spinoza's writing, it looks as if Spinoza was rather worried about his health. He appears to have had a rather frail constitution, which was beset by a string of minor ailments, such as would have been the envy of a hypochondriac like Descartes, who had departed 15 years previously for the great medicine chest in the sky. Spinoza lived a very simple life, boarding in a single room. Here he not only slept and wrote, but apparently quite often did his lens grinding too. It doesn't take much imagination to picture the sheaves of paper and opened books covered in a thin layer of glass dust. And it's possible that here too he had a small latticed window with a view out over the flat fields of potato patches and canals beneath the gloomy grey skies. This might also have provided a useful source of flies for his resident spiders. According to one source, Spinoza often lived all day on a milk sop done with butter and a pot of beer, and on another day he might subsist on gruel done with raisins and butter. According to the same source, he drank only 2 half-pints of wine in a month, which would have constituted heroic abstinence in the Holland of his day, although one suspects that he took even this only to fortify his blood. Spinoza is said to have described his way of life as just making both ends meet, like a snake with its tail in its mouth. Now in his early 30s, Spinoza had lost the arrogance of his youth. This is usually put down to the spiritually beneficial effects of blossoming genius, though in most cases when genius bursts into full exotic bloom, the effect is precisely the opposite. Megalomania and solipsism being the usual occupational hazards of this tantrum-bedevilled state. In fact, Spinoza's loss of arrogance was probably due to the slow but inexorable realization that his great philosophy, to which he had devoted his entire life, could never achieve widespread recognition during his lifetime. All hope of publication gradually faded, a grinding humiliation capable of extinguishing all manner of pride. Even so, Spinoza felt the need to explain himself, to demonstrate to the world, and especially to his religious opponents, that his philosophy was not incompatible with orthodox belief in God. So when he had finished writing the Ethics, he started into a new book called Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, a treatise on theology and politics. Spinoza's Tractatus is an odd work, a blend of political theory and biblical commentary. He told his friends he was trying to prepare the way for the eventual publication of the Ethics by demonstrating that the liberty to philosophize is compatible with devout piety and with the peace of the state. Spinoza was perhaps the greatest of all philosophical rationalists, but at this point it's difficult to be persuaded that he was arguing rationally. His impersonal pantheistic God bears no relation to the Jehovah of the Bible, and his theory that when we harm others we harm ourselves squared with neither contemporary religious attitudes toward heretics and unbelievers, nor contemporary political and moral attitudes toward almost anyone. And his view that the miracles of the Bible were simply natural events, which had been deliberately misinterpreted for purposes of religious propaganda, was unlikely to win his book many glowing reviews in the church press. Be this as it may, Spinoza has some interesting and surprisingly modern things to say about political theory. His thinking was in many ways a response to the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, whose pioneering work Leviathan had been published in 1651, less than 20 years earlier. In Leviathan, Hobbes had put forward the pessimistic view that, without government, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Human beings had found this state of nature unbearable and had congregated in governed societies to overcome it. Any form of government was better than none, and thus we should obey whoever is in charge. Spinoza took a more benevolent view of humanity, and his political theory was essentially liberal. Instead of supporting the state at all costs, he believed that the state, or its sovereign, justifies its power only by guaranteeing the security of its citizens and allowing individuals to develop their minds and use their reason without restraint. The state was there only to protect the individual, who must be allowed to pursue his own ends. In Spinoza's rather optimistic view, this involved mastering the passions and using reason to gain a deeper understanding of oneself and the world. Where the 17th-century version of the beer-fueled football hooligan or couch potato fitted into this is unclear. Spinoza also rather ingenuously maintained that the state should be self-limiting in its powers. It must act in accord with reason, and this means granting full freedom of thought and opinion. But here he realistically discriminates between thought and action. We must be allowed the freedom to think what we like, but our actions may be constrained by the state. and by actions he here includes public expressions of thought in any way likely to rouse the mob. Spinoza's political theory very much reflects his own situation in Holland. Here there was tolerant government and freedom of thought, within limits. Spinoza's thoughts often went beyond these limits, but in wonder. It is not difficult to imagine Spinoza, wrapped in wonder, contemplating his God, who has no connection with any other thing because he is everything. But his definition of love as pleasure accompanied by the idea of an external cause would not seem to accord with his conception of amor intellectualis Dei, the intellectual love of God. In Spinoza's view, and the view of modern psychology, this intellectual love of God would have insights. There is no hope without fear, and no fear without hope. Both confidence and despair arise from the idea of a thing future or past concerning which reason for doubt has been removed. However, this same matter of doubt and error reveals a serious flaw in Spinoza's philosophy. Spinoza himself had no doubts about the truth and certainty of his thought. I do not presume that I have found the best philosophy in the light of modern psychology. Desire is defined as the very essence of man, and pleasure is man's transition from a state of less perfection to a state of greater perfection. Pain is the opposite. Spinoza goes on to state, wonder is the thought of anything on which the mind stays fixed, because this particular thought has no connection with any others. Consider this in the light of Plato's celebrated dictum, philosophy begins because it is God. The universe is thus without meaning, yet at the same time is its own meaning. Many of Spinoza's ideas have a deep resonance, and are illuminating to those who neither believe in God nor his system. His theory of emotions is particularly prescient. Unlike so many pre-20th century philosophical theories, Spinoza's does not appear inadequate or naive, or just plain wrong, necessarily include an element of self-love, if God and all nature are the same thing, and this element would not have an external cause. Spinoza attempts to defend himself against this charge by maintaining, the mind's intellectual love of God is part of the infinite love by which God loves himself. But this would only seem to confirm the flaw in his argument. Despite such apparent inconsistencies, his theory goes on to prove several profound